Hey guys, this video will be phase 3 of my what if Marvel still regains all the rights of their characters. And so this will be the conclusion of my first saga of the Marvel Universe, which is the Secret Invasion saga. So without further delay, let's begin. Kicking off this phase will be Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 3. And I wanted to make this the beginning of the phase just to set up hype and have this season tease more of the Skrulls and how they plan on invading Earth. And so this season will basically be a setup in which will ultimately cultivate into the finale of the phase. So it's better to plant the seeds early and then watch it grow later on. The next project after will be Avengers Civil War, which will be taking Captain America's Civil War's original release date, and this movie would pretty much be similar to that version of the movie, except the focus will be more centralized on the Avengers team instead of just Captain America, since this is an Avengers movie. So the movie would start the same way, with Crossbones and his group of terrorists in Lagos, Nigeria, and the Avengers that will be on this mission will be Captain America, Black Widow, Falcon, and Hawkeye, who is not in retirement in this movie. So the opening sequence will relatively stay the same, minus Scarlet Witch, since she's still in the X-Men side of things. And the ending of the battle between Captain America and Crossbones would proceed the same way, except when Captain America defeats Crossbones, Crossbones won't just have like a bomb vest. He'll actually have another bomb planted on top of the same building that exploded in the original movie. And so I'm planning on having Crossbones survive this movie to be a future antagonist in later films. And so Crossbones would mock Captain America, saying, "You thought that the bomb you disarmed was the only one I planted?" Which, as if on cue, a massive chunk of a building would explode, leaving a bunch of casualties and insurmountable amount of deaths and injuries. And so Falcon would try his best to do fire and rescue, while Hawkeye and Black Widow would assist, and Captain America would just be shocked and devastated, which would ultimately cultivate into the government enforcing the Registration Act onto the Avengers even more, which leads us into our next scene, in which Thunderbolt Ross has a meeting with all the members of the Avengers, in which he basically informs them of the Registration Act and how if they don't sign, then they'll have to be arrested. So the group that agrees with the Registration Act would be Tony, who still gets confronted by that same lady from the original movie, in which her son was killed due to the results of the Avengers' battle with Ultron in Sokovia, as well as Rhodey, who also agrees with the Registration Act, Black Widow, Hank, who is returned from his journey of self-reflection, even though him and Janet aren't really talking that much due to the Ultron incident, as well as Vision, who sees as working as the government would be the only opportunity for the Avengers to actually save lives while being in accordance with the US laws. The side that disagrees with the Registration Act would be Captain America, of course, who believes that if the Avengers sign this Registration Act, then they'll basically be signing away their freedom and have to work under the government, in which Steve, who is still relatively fresh from the Winter Soldier, knows that any major organizations cannot be trusted due to the fact of an infiltration can happen, just like how Hydra infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. for all this time. And so Steve, still not trusting the government, would obviously disagree with the act, as well as Janet, who shares the same viewpoints as Steve, Hawkeye, and Falcon. This would lead into the same type of argument that they would have in Civil War, in which the scene would then shift to Steve at Peggy Carter's funeral, in which Natasha is with him and trying to comfort him through the loss. And I want to establish a bit of romantic connection between the two, as in Winter Soldier, I always found it disappointing how that was basically hinted at in Winter Soldier, but never followed through again in Age of Ultron. And also, I'm not really a fan of Hulk and Black Widow in the movies. I don't really get how that makes sense. So, yeah. The next scene would still include the United Nations having a council meeting in which King T'Chaka would give his speech about how the Avengers must have limitations or else they're no better than the people that they fight against, which would lead into the council still getting bombed, and the culprit that I'll have behind that will be none other than Baron Zemo, who will have a more comic accurate outfit to go along with his motives, as well as a sword, just for some cool fight scenes later on in the movie. Also, I forgot to mention this, but Winter Soldier won't really be in this movie. He'll be mentioned by Steve, but he won't be a factor in this movie, since one of the things that annoyed me with the original Civil War movie was how Winter Soldier was basically the catalyst of the Avengers fighting, which in the comics, the Registration Act was the main reason why the Avengers were disagreeing with each other. So Winter Soldier won't not be in this version of the movie. And so Prince T'Challa, well, now King T'Challa, because, will be still grieving the passing of his father. And since he doesn't really have anyone to direct his anger towards, since he doesn't know who caused the bombing, and would instead further agree with his father's statement with the Avengers needing limitations, and which would ultimately cause him to sign in accordance with the Registration Act. And so Captain America and Black Widow would have a meeting with each other, and they'll basically be talking about the Registration Act and about the recent attack on the U.S. Nations Council, in which Captain America would suddenly feel a bullet shot grace his cheek, and due to his super soldier reflexes, he manages to get Black Widow out of the way and manages to catch a glimpse at a distant sniper, and he manages to see that it's Baron Zemo, who Captain America doesn't know it's Baron Zemo since he never met him before. And so Captain America would proceed to chase down Zemo, and which would result in the same type of chase scene that happens in Civil War, excluding Black Panther. And so during that chase scene, Zemo would cause all types of collateral damage while Captain America is trying to chase him down, which would lead into Zemo getting captured by Captain America and Steve just questioning him on who he is and proceeds to unmask him. And Zemo would then proceed to give the exposition of the Avengers ruining his life, but with their battle in Sokovia, causing the death of all his family members, and would reveal his plan on releasing an army of super soldiers under his control, and which would lead into eventually taking over the country. Zemo would then manage to slip out of Cap's grasp and get away, leaving Captain America to be the one to blame for all the casualties caused by Zemo, which further solidifies the government's points in having the Avengers sign the Registration Act in order to prevent less casualties. This would then lead into Captain America assembling a team to help him stop Zemo from enacting his plan, and that team would include him, Hawkeye, Wasp, Falcon, as well as Goliath, who Wasp manages to get in contact with after some time, and she would brief him on the situation in which Goliath would choose to help Team Captain America, disagreeing with the Registration Act. This would lead into Iron Man also assembling a team to stop Cap from doing reckless things, and that team would ultimately consist of him, War Machine, Vision, and Hank Pym, who is now seen to be donning his Yellow Jacket persona, as well as Black Widow, who is still feels neutral in all of this conflict. And Tony would mention that he needs to make a quick stop before all of them would go and try and stop Captain America. And the screen would then cut to a college campus, in which we would recognize as Empire State University. And inside that campus, we would catch a glimpse of a familiar face, which would be none other than Peter Parker, who is about 19 to 20 years old at this point, and he has not donned the mask ever since the tragedy that still haunts him the night that Gwen Stacy died. And so Peter is in class taking notes until an intercom would come off and telling Peter Parker to come into the dean's office. And so Peter, confused, would walk towards the office and would see that no one was inside until the door suddenly closes and Peter tenses up. And the person behind the door would be revealed to be none other than Tony Stark. Peter would recognize immediately who it was and would almost start fanboying a little bit before being confused on why Tony Stark, of all people, would call him into the office. Tony would then reveal that he's known about his Spider-Man activities for a while now, and also knows how Peter has been missing in action for a little over 2 years. Peter would hesitate, but then inform Tony of why he quit being Spider-Man. Tony would sympathize with Peter, and they would have that same type of bond that they have in the original movie, in which Tony would try and tell Peter that what happens at the Brooklyn Bridge wasn't his fault, but Peter is still haunted by the guilt. And then Tony gives a speech on how our mistakes don't define us, only the future and how we proceed it do. And this would resonate with Peter, before Tony would then give the offer of Peter joining the Avengers and helping him stop Captain America from doing the same type of mistake. Peter would falter, and the screen would linger on, leaving it ambiguous if Peter accepted Tony's offer or denied it. And so the next scene would see Captain America and his group of Avengers in the airport, running to get to the helicopter before it's inhibited by one of Tony's chips, who flies down and confronts Cap and his team. Tony would then try one last time to convince Cap to stop what he's doing. Cap would of course not budge, which would lead into all of the teams interacting with each other, in which Black Panther would also make an appearance, now donning his vibranium suit, as well as Spider-Man, who webs Cap's hands and takes his shield, imitating the same action that Tom Holland used in the original Civil War. This would then lead into Wasp shrinking down and manages to latch on to Cap's shield undetected. And due to Peter not being Spider-Man for over 2 years, his skills are a bit rusty. And so Wasp takes advantage of this opportunity and returns back to a normal size to uppercut Spider-Man, initiating the first blow of the battle, in which everyone would fight their respective opponents. Team Iron Man seems to be getting the upper hands at first. That is until Goliath would tumble down into the battlefield, ready to aid Team Cap against their battle against Team Iron Man. By the way, I meant to add Goliath in my version of Giant Man and the Wasp, but for some reason while I was making that video, he just slipped my mind and I completely forgot to add him. So for continuity's sake, Goliath was present in that movie to help Ant-Man and Wasp defeat MODOK. And so with that out of the way, Goliath would even the playing field, taking on Vision as he was Team Iron Man's heavy hitter. So everyone's fight would be pretty even at this point in time, and we would even get a couple of interactions with some of the characters who are fighting each other, such as Spider-Man and Captain America. Spider-Man in this version would put up much better of a fight since he actually has battle experience with superpowered opponents. But even though he has more experience than Tom Holland, he still hasn't been in fighting crime for the past 2 years. And so his skills would be a bit rusty, and Cap would notice this and take advantage, which would ultimately lead into Captain America winning the fight. And we would also have a scene in which Yellow Jacket and Wasp are interacting, and Wasp is still pissed at Hank for not only the Ultron incident, but for siding with Tony in the Registration Act. And Hank would try to defend himself, saying that this was the best course of action for the Avengers, as they were seen as too dangerous. Wasp would retort, the reason why the government doesn't trust the Avengers in the first place was because of Ultron, which was Hank's invention. And so the fighting would continue until Team Cap would eventually gain the upper hand, which would then force Tony into calling his secret weapon, which would be the Thor clone, or in other words, Ragnarok, who unleashes thunder and lightning onto the battlefield, defeating any team member that was associated with Captain America. Team Cap would eventually find themselves to be overwhelmed and would be forced to retreat. That is until Goliath would offer to distract the Thor clone while the other members get away, which would lead into exchange between Goliath and Ragnarok, which would ultimately lead into Goliath being critically injured. This would spark some eternal conflict within some of the team members and would leave them wondering if they're really fighting on the right side. And with that, Team Cap manages to get away, and Team Iron Man would try to pursue them but would lose them due to the Quinjet's no tracking ability. And so Captain America and his team would arrive at Zemo's lair, which would reveal that there was never any army of super soldiers but only 5, those of which Zemo killed, and which Zemo would reveal himself, and Captain America would ask what was the purpose of all this, and Zemo would reveal his real plan, which was not to release an army of super soldiers, but to tear the Avengers apart from the inside for what they did to his family in Sokovia. Team Iron Man would also eventually catch up to Team Cap, which would lead into another altercation. Zemo would manage to get away, but not until Black Panther would manage to catch a glimpse of him and would be curious and suspicious to see what this new guy was up to. And so he would follow Zemo, and all the rest of the teams would continue their fight. And so Zemo would be outside of the lair, and he would attempt to escape, but he would get caught up by Black Panther. Zemo would then reveal to Black Panther that he was the one who caused the bombing in the United Nations building, which would understandably enrage Black Panther, and this would lead into a fight between Baron Zemo with his sword and Black Panther, and it would be a vicious battle, which would eventually lead into Black Panther's victory. But before Black Panther can stick his claws through Zemo's neck, he has a flashback and remembers his father's words and what his father would have wanted. So with a heavy heart, Black Panther would retract his claws and knock out Zemo, not killing him. The fighting would still ensue, with Team Cap gaining the upper hand. As Cap would deal the finishing blow to knock Tony out, he would look around and see the carnage and chaos that is ensued due to the Avengers agreement. And so, with a heavy heart, Cap would lay down his shield and submit to be arrested, which he would, as well as the remaining team members of Team Captain America. The movie would end with all the members of Team Captain America being arrested, as well as Zemo, who was seen smiling as he knew that in the end, he got what he wanted. And so the screen would cut to black. The next movie of this phase would be Doctor Strange. And this movie wouldn't really change, as I find this to be a really awesome movie, and it doesn't really have anything that I would personally change, so this movie would stay the same. The next MCU project will be Daredevil Season 2, which would also stay the same, as I don't really see any need to change anything. But if I were to add some parts, it would be some references to the Registration Act, as well as still some references to Spider-Man here and there, and J. Jonah Jameson would also make another appearance in this season. Now, the movie following Daredevil will be X-Men: Dark Phoenix. And this movie would explain why the X-Men weren't present during the events of Civil War. So I'd have this film take place during the events of Civil War. And the movie would open up with a scene of an 8-year-old Jean Grey, who is seen in the backseat of a car with what is assumed to be her parents in the front seats. And it's a normal occasion until Jean would suddenly feel a strange sensation in her head, in which that strange sensation would turn into a physical incarnation. And due to this, the car would flip over and would crash into a nearby mountainside. killing Jean Grey's parents. Jean Grey would of course survive, and she would be shocked and devastated by the loss. And the police would try their best to comfort her, but they would be at a loss for words as to what caused the crash, not knowing that the cause was right in front of them. And so the scene would shift into Jean Grey cycling through many orphanages until the screen would later reveal a young Charles Xavier that walks up to a young Jean Grey and informs him that he himself is also special. Jean Grey would not know what Charles would originally mean until Charles would showcase some of his abilities, in which Jean Grey would perk up and Charles would reveal that he intends to take Jean into a school for gifted youngsters. Fast forward, and the movie would shift into a now present-day Jean Grey, in which the X-Men are currently on a mission to outer space to rescue stray astronauts that were involved in a mysterious cosmic explosion caused by the space around. And so we would get the usual X-Men banter here and there until they would finally encounter the spacecraft and would proceed to get as many astronauts as they can, in which there would be some cosmic interferences in which Jean Grey would notice and try to subdue it. But it proves to be too much until Jean Grey would later absorb all the cosmic rays that were interfering with the spaceship and would unknowingly absorb the powers of the Phoenix. Jean would knock out, which would lead into Cyclops taking her back to the X-Men spacecraft and laying her down to rest. Jean would later wake up a bit disorientated, but she would later realize that she is now in the X-Men labs, in which she is tended to by Beast. Beast would ask Jean how she is feeling, and Jean would try to respond, but then a certain power would erupt inside her, causing her to lash out unexpectedly and attack Beast. Beast would try his best to defend himself, but it proves to be no use, as Jean would be too much and overpower him. The rest of the X-Men would come into the scene, but Jean would also defeat them as well and escape the X-Mansion. The X-Men, now at a loss, would try their best to find and take Jean back to the X-Mansion, but their efforts proved to be fruitless, as Jean has already made it too far. We cut to a screen of a spaceship that is on the Earth's atmosphere. A spaceship that will reveal to be inhabited by the Skrulls, the leader of which is curious of the planet, or more specifically, more curious in the individual known as Jean Grey, otherwise the only person who managed to harness the Phoenix power, which interests them very greatly. The screen would cut to Jean Grey, who is now calmed down enough, and she is seen walking through her childhood neighborhood, trying to recollect her emotions and trying to find the best way to control her power. And it is not until she manages to stumble upon her own childhood home, in which she starts to feel those emotions surging up again, which would ultimately lead into a massive explosion that blows up the whole block. The news coverage is already on this, in which interests a certain individual who we know as Magneto, who makes his way to the area, as well as his Brotherhood of Mutants, who the members would consist of Mystique, Blob, Toad, Juggernaut, Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, and Rogue. The X-Men would hear of this event as well and would also make their way to Jean, leading into a confrontation between the X-Men and the Brotherhood of Mutants, who would proceed to battle, in which Jean would also make her presence known and would proceed to decimate the two teams, which would result in the X-Men and Brotherhood of Mutants teaming up in order to subdue Jean Grey, who is too powerful in her Phoenix state. This event would cause mass casualties, in which Jean Grey would manage to defeat the two teams and fly off into the atmosphere before she is none other stopped by the same ship and abducted and taken off into another location. The X-Men would be confused on what the hell just happened. The Brotherhood would also like some answers. And begrudgingly, both the X-Men and the Brotherhood would team up just this once to stop Jean Grey from causing the same amount of destruction that happens in this very moment. And so, using Cerebro, Charles would manage to track Jean Grey, letting the X-Men and Brotherhood diverge to her location. In the ship, we would see Jean Grey, who was a little confused and a bit aggressive, until a shadowy figure would approach from the distance, and out would appear the Skrull Queen, who would reveal her intentions to Jean Grey and would offer her assistance in helping her control the Phoenix powers. Jean Grey would be curious and would listen to this otherworldly being. The Skrull Queen, also known as Veronica, would indulge Jean Grey behind the lore of the Phoenix, in which she would reveal that the Phoenix actually destroyed the Skrulls' home world, which is why they travel from planet to planet in order to improve them and try and build a new Skrull world where children can roam free and the Skrull people can finally be at peace and have homes. Jean Grey would sympathize with this and would agree to help Veronica achieve her goal. Her and the Skrull Queen would land the Skrull ship onto a nearby meadow, in which the X-Men and Brotherhood managed to catch up and confront Jean Grey, as well as this new outworldly visitor. And the X-Men and the Brotherhood would try their best to subdue Jean Grey, but she is too powerful with the Phoenix and manages to defeat everyone at the same time. That is until Charles Xavier would enter the battlefield and enter Jean's mind, trying to remind her of the person that she once was. Jean would struggle and engage in a mental battle with Charles, the distraction serving long enough to Rogue to appear behind Jean Grey and steal some of her powers, which would weaken Jean Grey enough to have her be beaten by Charles's mental attack. This is where Veronica would step in. With her legion of Skrulls, they would pursue to attack the X-Men and their Brotherhood, who would defend themselves. Jean Grey would also assist in helping Veronica, but that isn't until Cyclops would confront Jean and ask her why she's helping the enemy. Jean would tell Cyclops that Veronica intends to make a better home for her people. Cyclops would obviously see through this and would know that there are ulterior motives behind the Skrull Queen. Veronica would scoff and order Jean to kill Cyclops. This would cause Jean to hesitate and face Veronica. Veronica would then later reveal her true motives about how she plans to conquer Earth and using her army of Skrulls to do it. This would enrage Jean Grey, and she would proceed to have a major battle with the Skrull Queen, in which Jean Grey would not be accustomed to her Phoenix powers, and which would ultimately lead into the Skrull Queen trying to absorb some of the powers that are locked in Jean Grey. This would lead into not only a physical battle, but a mental battle, in which Jean Grey would manage to come out on top by oversurging the Skrull Queen with so much force that it manages to eviscerate the Skrull Queen. Jean Grey would then fly up into the atmosphere, knowing that the power of the Phoenix would be too much to bear, and manages to flies up to the stratosphere. No, the outer atmosphere, and blows up in a massive fire and light explosion, sacrificing herself to save her comrades. The ending would be a memorial for Jean Grey, and noting her sacrifice, as well as enlisting new members for the X-Men, which would include Rogue, Gambit, and Nightcrawler. There would be another post-credit scene, which would include another Skrull ship in outer space. The screen would then cut to a Skrull leader who hears about the death of their queen and would vow to find a planet in which their queen would die on and invade it in her honor. For the Skrull Empire. The next MCU movie I have planned will be The Amazing Spider-Man 3, which sees the return of Peter Parker donning the mask as Spider-Man, as per before in his debut in Civil War. And so this movie would follow Peter still in his college life, trying to balance classes and his Spider-Man duties at the same time, while also still feeling guilty about the death of Gwen Stacy. Peter will still be working at the Bugle, but will come face to face with the Daily Bugle's new hire, who is Eddie Brock. And so Eddie would then shake Peter's hand, and Peter would welcome him into the Bugle, with Jonah Jameson still up to his antics about how Spider-Man is a menace and he should be arrested. And Peter and Eddie establishing sort of a bond just for setting up like the eventual rivalry they'll have later on. This movie will also feature Mary Jane Watson, as she is one of Peter's classmates and Peter has grown a bit of a attachment with, but due to the passing of Gwen Stacy, he tries to keep his distance as a means of keeping MJ away from his superhero life. And we'll also see the return of Harry Osborn, who is still running Oscorp even after the death of Norman Osborn in the last movie. So Harry would actually introduce Peter to one of his mentors and one of the people who actually helped and advised Harry on how to run Oscorp. And so that person would be revealed to be Dr. Otto Octavius, Harry's mentor. Otto shook Peter's hand and complimented him on his demeanor and what he's heard from Harry. And Octavius would actually invite both Peter and Harry to one of his showings in which he'll actually showcase a brand new invention that he's been working on. And Peter and Harry would, of course, accept, as Peter is a huge science nerd and Harry sees this as more opportunities for networking. We cut to about nighttime, and Peter is on his evening patrols until he manages to catch a glimpse of a mysterious figure jumping from building to building. So Spider-Man, curious, would proceed to follow the figure. And so the figure would eventually stop at a lab in which she would manage to sneak in undetected and attempt to steal a lot of valuables and expensive items. This would lead into a web being shot at her hand, trapping her temporarily. She would turn around to see the culprit, and it would reveal Spider-Man, who is still in his joking mood and basically taunts the thief for being so cliche. And so the thief would be revealed to be none other than Black Cat. And so Black Cat would then remark that if anyone's cliche, then it's the weirdo dressing in red tights. She manages to free herself using her retractable claws and proceeds to have a brief altercation with Spider-Man. The fight would be pretty even until Black Cat manages to get the upper hand and double kick Spider-Man in the face, managing to stumble him back just enough for her to slip away. Spider-Man would try to pursue her, and it would involve a chase scene in which Black Cat is just running through the New York skyline and Spider-Man is attempting to capture her. But Black Cat would manage to get away, leaving Spider-Man wondering just who the hell was that lady. The scene would shift into the next morning, where Otto is revealing his brand new project, in which amongst the crowd would be Peter and Harry. Peter would be obviously impressed, while Harry is looking impressed as well, but you can still see hints of sadness and a bit of resentment, as he's still angry about the death of his father and would still face the withdrawals from his drug abuse. The machine that Otto would be presenting would be a set of mechanical tentacles aimed at helping people proceed with tasks that they otherwise wouldn't be able to due to an amputated limb or such as the sort. And so Otto would unveil and demonstrate this product, in which Of course, something would go wrong and Otto would lose control of the tentacles, and the tentacles would just cause mass chaos around that area, endangering the lives of many others. Peter would excuse himself and slip out the crowd, gearing up as Spider-Man, and hops back into the action to stop Otto's tentacles from causing havoc. Otto would be confused and try to stop Spider-Man from destroying his work, and manages to hit Spider-Man using one of his tentacles. Spider-Man crashes into a wall, but is undefeated and manages to stop Otto by knocking him out, and thus having the tentacles fall limply to the ground. The police will collect Otto and take him back to a surgery lab, in which they intend to move the tentacles surgically. This would go as bad as well as you would expect, and Otto would escape the surgery lab and go off on his own. And the tentacles would be influencing his actions, and he would blame Spider-Man for the failure of his invention, and thus would be determined on getting the resources necessary to create another invention. But in order to get those resources, he would need to have money. And so he travels to Oscorp, in which he ambushes Harry Osborn, who is shocked at Otto and his display of tentacles. And so Otto would demand Harry where is the vault that Oscorp keeps its profits. And then Harry would be startled, and an Oscorp employee will attempt to dial the police, but Otto would kill him using one of the spears in his tentacles. And so the media down below would have a coverage of cameras pointing up into the Oscorp building and looking at the damage that Otto has caused, which of course would attract the attention of Spider-Man, who swings into the Oscorp building and proceeds to battle Otto. Otto, who still blames Spider-Man for the destruction of his machine, would proceed to fight with malice and intent to kill. Spider-Man would be overwhelmed by the tentacles, and the battle would persist outside, where they would crash into a train. It is a hard-fought battle until Otto manages to sneak away with the profits from Oscorp. And so Spider-Man would try and track down Otto to his lair. But on the way, he would encounter none other than Black Cat, who expresses interest in Spider-Man and asks him why he does what he does. Spider-Man, who is a bit of on a time crunch, would try and get past Black Cat. But Black Cat isn't letting him off so easily. So frustrated, Spider-Man would then quickly explain about what he believes in responsibility, and how with great power there must also come great responsibility. Black Cat would be intrigued, and this would be a setup for some romantic feelings that Black Cat would harbor for Spider-Man. And so Spider-Man would make his way into Dr. Octopus's lair, in which he manages to have a final battle with Doc Ock. It's a grueling fight, and Doc Ock manages to get the upper hand and would almost kill Spider-Man using one of his tentacles, if not for the efforts of Black Cat, who saved Spider-Man at the last second. And so with the help of Black Cat, Spider-Man manages to subdue Dr. Octopus and take him away to Rikers Island. We would then cut to a scene with Spider-Man and Black Cat alone on the rooftop. Spider-Man would ask Black Cat why she helped him fight Dr. Octopus. Black Cat would ask, "Isn't it obvious?" And Spider-Man would be confused. That is until Black Cat rolls up the bottom of his mask and plants a kiss on him. Black Cat would then depart, leaving a very confused and a bit flustered Spider-Man to ponder on what the hell just happened. We cut to Empire State University, where Peter and Mary Jane Watson are talking on a project, and MJ would express interest on Peter and would proceed to ask him out. Peter would hesitate, that is until he would begrudgingly say yes, after learning that he needs to let people inside of his circle again. And so the scene would end with Peter and MJ walking hand in hand. Not a couple, but just on an outing as friends. We would get a post-credit scene of Harry distraught in his Oscorp office. That is until he cracks a glass against the wall and manages to open a secret passageway, which would reveal Norman's old goblin gear, which would enlight green light on Harry's face, and the screen would cut to black. The next movie following will be Thor Ragnarok, which, for the record, will be a much more serious movie than it originally was in the MCU. And so, Taika Waititi will not be directing this film. Sorry, Taika Waititi fans. And so the movie would open up with Thor still in Surtur's domain, but the scene will be played out as much more serious, as he won't have that cliche, "You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation, huh?" So, no, there'll be none of that, and Surtur will still tell Thor about the fate of Ragnarok and how he intends to plunge his sword into Asgard and destroy it, and Thor will still manage to escape Surtur's realm and return to Asgard, in which he still discovers that Loki has been disguising himself as Odin for the past couple years, which would understandably make Thor very angry, and he would demand Loki as to where is Odin. And Loki would reveal that he has hidden Odin away somewhere in Midgard. And so Thor would travel along with Loki back to Midgard, in which they would confront Doctor Strange, who would still help the brothers out, and you can imagine there could be some banter between Loki and Doctor Strange on who's the better sorcerer. And so with the help of Doctor Strange, Thor and Loki managed to find Odin, but Odin would reveal to his sons that he is dying, and with his death will soon awaken a monster. A being whose sole purpose is to eradicate the gods, and that being's name is Mangog. And so Odin will still pass, and a portal will open up, revealing a gargantuan foul beast known as Mangog. Thor would realize instantly that if they were to fight here, then the results would be catastrophic. So he summons the Bifrost to teleport him, Loki, and Mangog away from Midgard. But Mangog would be too powerful, and the trio would end up fighting in the Bifrost, in which Thor and Loki would try their best to fight Mangog, but the monster proves to be too powerful. And so Mangog would proceed to beat down Thor and would break Mjolnir in the process. Loki would try to assist, but Mangog would grab his face and toss him away outside of the Bifrost, leaving him to be stranded on another planet. He would then punch Thor away as well, and leaving Thor also in a stranded planet. And so, with no one else left to stop him, Mangog would arrive at Asgard, in which he manages to decimate the Warriors 3, as well as the Asgardian forces. And so Thor would be stranded on a distant planet, in which he would meet a future ally, who is Beta Ray Bill, who hasn't received his powers yet, but Thor would see him as a pure-hearted person, and thus would ask for his help on how he can receive a new hammer in order to fight against Mangog. Beta Ray Bill would point him to the direction of Eitri, and with both him and Beta Ray Bill would go towards, and Eitri would agree to help Thor, and would even offer to make Bill a version of Mjolnir as well, which we would know as Stormbreaker. And so with the help of Beta Ray Bill, Thor go to Surtur's domain as a means of having Surtur assist him in stopping Mangog, as he realizes that Mangog would be too powerful for him and Beta Ray Bill to handle alone. Surtur would initially decline, but Thor would then promise him the battle he has been waiting for. And so with the help of Surtur, Thor and Beta Ray Bill would return to Asgard to have one final battle with Mangog. And the fighting would be pretty even, as Mangog would be a little overwhelmed by the forces of Surtur's army. But the beast would insist, and thus would proceed to decimate the army, which would leave Thor, Beta Ray Bill, and Surtur to fight the beast. And it leads into a 3v1, in which Mangog would still have the upper hand, even against Thor, Surtur, and Beta Ray Bill. It's not until Loki would appear, along with his new companion in Fenrir, in which the battle would finally turn the tides, in which the fighting would end with Surtur plunging his sword into Mangog as well as Asgard, which would destroy the whole of Asgard, which would result in an explosion that can be seen from miles. Thor, Beta Ray Bill, Loki, and the remaining Asgardians would manage to get away on a ship that Loki has stowaway on. And so the Asgardians would watch on as their home was being decimated and eventually destroyed. We would see amongst the crowd of Asgardians Enchantress and Scourge, who managed to slip away due to Mangog's reign, and thus would go by undetected, watching Asgard being destroyed.